Hello, Bobcats. Today is day 2 of lesson 2. Ready to begin? Great! Here we go. Here's a look at what we'll be doing today. We're going to start off with grammar, then vocabulary. We're rereading My Brother Martin and practicing our target skill and strategy. Let's jump into grammar. It's all about the different types of sentences. But Miss Webster, isn't a sentence just a sentence, you may ask? There are 4 types of sentences, actually. That's right, 4 types. While they all start with a capital letter and end with a punctuation mark, there's different ways we can describe different types of sentences. Let's start off with declarative. A declarative sentence is a statement that tells something and ends with a period. An imperative sentence is a sentence that gives a command. An interrogative sentence is a sentence that asks a question. An exclamatory sentence is a sentence that shows strong feelings and ends with an exclamation point. When I have to determine which type of sentence is which, I have to think, is this sentence making a statement, asking a question, giving a command, or showing a strong feeling? The punctuation usually gives us a great hint. So let's do some examples. Martin Luther King wanted to change things. This sentence is stating something. It's a declarative sentence. And I have, read some of the things he wrote. This ends in a period too, like a declarative sentence, but it's also commanding me to do something, to read. This is an imperative sentence. So now let's practice some together. I'll read the sentence. I'm going to give you 5 seconds to really think, what type of sentence is this? Remember, you have to ask yourself, is it asking me something, telling me something, giving a strong feeling, or giving me a command? The bus is here. Okay, which sentence do you think it is? If you chose declarative, you're correct. It's stating something. It's telling us the bus is here. Does this mean we won't be able to hear? Interrogative. That question mark will always give us a strong clue. So now let's move on to our vocabulary. Just like yesterday, I'll say the word, wait for you to repeat it, say the meaning, and a sentence. Our first word is dream. Dream means a hope for the future. Many people dream of fair treatment for all. It is their goal. Encounters is our next word. Encounters means meetings with people. Brief encounters or meetings with heroes can inspire kids to work for change. Preferred. Liking something better than something else. Some Americans have preferred or chosen to work for change as a group. Recall. To remember something. Most people can look back and recall a situation when they were treated unfairly. And our last word, example. I'm sure you've seen this plenty of times. Example means showing how to do something. It is easy to admire a leader who sets an example of fairness and equality. So now let's move on to our target skill and target strategy. As you remember from yesterday, our target skill is author's purpose, and our target strategy is to monitor and clarify. Today we're going to practice both our target skill and our target strategy. So as we read, I'm going to monitor what I read to make sure I understand and reread and think more closely about it if I don't. To practice our target skill, we want to see if there are certain details that appear throughout most of the text. And we're going to write down our ideas in our graphic organizer. Once we have all those details together, we can really think, is the author trying to persuade us, inform us, or entertain us? Remember that pie. So let's begin.
My brother Martin. A sister remembers growing up with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. We were born in the same room, my brother Martin and I. I was an early baby, born sooner than expected. Mother dear and Daddy placed me in the chifforobe drawer that stood in the corner of their upstairs bedroom. I got a crib a few days afterward. A year and a half later, Martin spent his first night in that hand-me-down crib in the very same room. The house where we were born belonged to Mother Dear's parents, our grandparents, the Reverend and Mrs. A.D. Williams. We lived there with them and our Aunt Ida, our grandmother's sister. And not long after my brother Martin, who we called M.L., because he and Daddy had the same name, our baby brother was born. His name was Alfred Daniel, but we called him A.D., after our grandfather. They called me Christine, and like 3 peas in one pod, we grew together. Our days and rooms were filled with adventure stories and tinker toys, with dolls and Monopoly and Chinese checkers. And although Daddy, who was an important minister, and Mother dear, who was known far and wide as a musician, often had work that took them away from home, our grandmother was always there to take care of us. I remember days sitting at her feet as she and Aunt Ida filled us with grand memories of their childhood and read to us about all the wonderful places in the world. And of course, my brothers and I had each other. We 3 stuck together like the pages in a brand new book. And being normal young children, we were almost always up to something. Our best prank involved a fur piece that belonged to our grandmother. It looked almost alive, with its tiny feet and little head and gleaming glass eyes. So, every once in a while, in a waning light of evening, we'd tie that fur piece to a stick and, hiding behind the hedge in front of our house, we would dangle it in front of the unsuspecting passers-by. Boy, you could hear the screams of fright all across the neighborhood. Then there was the time Mother dear decided that her children should all learn to play piano. I didn't mind too much, but M.L. and A.D. preferred being outside to being stuck inside with our piano teacher, Mr. Mann, who would rap your knuckles with a ruler just for playing the wrong notes. Well, one morning M.L. and A.D. decided to loosen the legs on the piano bench so we wouldn't have to practice. We didn't tell Mr. Mann, and when he sat, crash! Down he went. But mostly, we were good, obedient children, and M.L. did learn to play a few songs on the piano. He even went off to sing with our mother a time or two. Given his love for singing and music, I'm sure he could have become as good a musician as our mother, had his life not called him down a different path. But that's just what his life did. My brothers and I grew up a long time ago, back in a time when certain places in our country had unfair laws that said it was right to keep black people separate because our skin was darker and our ancestors had been captured in far-off Africa and brought to America as slaves.
As I'm monitoring as I read along, I notice how there's been a change in the feeling of the story. Now I want to think about how and why the feeling has changed. What are the words or sentences in the text that could help me understand? I'm going to reread. My brother and I grew up a long time ago. Back in a time when certain places in our country had unfair laws that said it was right to keep black people separate because our skin was darker and our ancestors had been captured in far-off Africa and brought to America as slaves. Before, we were reading about how Christine and her brothers played together, listened to stories from their aunt and grandmother, and played pranks on their piano teacher and their neighbors. That feeling was happy. But now that I've reread this page, I see that it's becoming less happy because the author is talking about unfair laws that the King children grew up with. Let's keep reading.
Atlanta, Georgia, the city in which we were growing up, had those laws. Because of those laws, my family rarely went to the picture shows or visited Grant Park with its famous cyclorama. In fact, to this very day, I don't recall ever seeing my father on a streetcar. Because of those laws and the indignity that went with them, Daddy preferred keeping ML, AD, and me close to home, where we'd be protected. We lived in...
Let's pause here. What other details in the text tell more or support that segregation laws were unfair? Right. So, in the text it says, my family rarely went to picture shows, such as movies, or visited Grant Park with its famous cyclorama because of those laws. And the author also says, I don't recall ever seeing my father on a streetcar. Because of those laws and the indignity that went with them, Daddy preferred keeping ML, AD, and me close to home, where we'd be protected.
We lived in a neighborhood in Atlanta that's now called Sweet Auburn. It was named for Auburn Avenue, the street that ran in front of our house. On our side of the street stood two-story frame houses, similar to the one we lived in. Across it crouched a line of one-story row houses and a store owned by a white family. When we were young, all the children along Auburn Avenue played together, even the two boys whose parents owned the store. And since our house was the favorite gathering place, those boys played with us in our backyard and ran with ML and AD to the firehouse on the corner where they watched the engines and the firemen. The thought of not playing with those kids because they were different, because they were white and we were black, never entered our minds. Well, one day, ML and AD went to get their playmates from across the street, just as they had done 100 times before. But they came home alone. The boys had told my brothers that they couldn't play together anymore because AD and ML were Negroes. And that was it. Shortly afterward, the family sold the store and moved away. We never saw or heard from them again. Looking back, I realized that it was only a matter of time before the generations of cruelty and injustice that Daddy and Mother Dear and Mama and Aunt Ida had been shielding us from finally broke through. But back then, it was a crushing blow that seemed to come out of nowhere. Why do white people treat colored people so mean? ML asked Mother Dear afterward. And with me and ML and AD standing in front of her, trying our best to understand, Mother Dear gave the reason behind it all. Her words explained the streetcars our family avoided and the whites-only sign that kept us off the elevator at City Hall. Her words told why there were parks and museums that black people could not visit, and why some restaurants refused to serve us, and why hotels wouldn't give us rooms, and why theaters would only allow us to watch their picture shows from the balcony. But her words also gave us hope. She answered simply, because they just don't understand that everyone is the same. But someday It will be better. And my brother M.L. looked up into our mother's face and said the words I remember to this day. He said, "Mother dear, one day I'm going to turn this world upside down." In the coming years, there would be other reminders of the cruel system called segregation that sought to keep black people down. But it was Daddy who showed ML and AD and me how to speak out against hatred and bigotry and stand up for what's right. Daddy was the minister at Ebenezer Baptist Church, and after losing our playmates, when ML, AD, and I heard our father speak from his pulpit, his words held new meaning. And Daddy practiced what he preached. He always stood up for himself when confronted with hatred and bigotry. And each day he shared his encounters at the dinner table. When a shoe salesman told Daddy and ML that he'd only serve them in the back of the store because they were black, Daddy took ML somewhere else to buy new shoes. Another time, a police officer pulled Daddy over and called him boy. Daddy pointed to ML sitting next to him in the car and said, "This is a boy. I am a man, and until you call me one, I will not listen to you." These stories were as nourishing as the food that was set before us.
The author describes how her father told the family about his encounters when faced with hatred and bigotry. She says that her father practiced what he preached. Can you find evidence the author includes to support this? Right. She says that when a salesperson refused to sell him shoes, he went to another store. He also told the police officer not to call him boy. These details are also explaining and showing us how unfairly Black Americans were treated during this time.
Years would pass, and many new lessons would be learned. There would be numerous speeches and marches and prizes. But my brother never forgot the example of our father, or the promise he had made to our mother on the day his friends turned him away. And when he was much older, my brother ML dreamed a dream that turned the world upside down.
Now that we've gone through our story, let's take those same ideas that we discussed and put them in our graphic organizer to see if we can determine what the author's purpose or reason for writing this biography is. One detail that we noticed was when the author's father describes times he was treated unfairly. Another detail we read was how ML and AD's white friends were told not to play with them anymore because they were black. And lastly, we understood more about how segregation affected Black people when Mother Dear explained to the children the white-only signs and how that kept them from using elevators, going to certain places like parks and museums, or being treated differently, like having to sit in the balcony at picture shows. With all these details together, we can think about what was the author's purpose in writing this book. Were they trying to persuade us, inform us, or entertain us? Remember, persuade means to try to convince someone to do something. When looking at my graphic organizer, I don't see any details that point towards the author trying to convince us to do anything. We're left with entertain and inform. With your class, discuss which purpose would best make sense. If you decided inform, that is correct. The author's purpose is to inform us about how segregation allowed African Americans to be treated unfairly. Each of the details we discussed and wrote down support this purpose. Now you'll continue working with the skill of author's purpose in small group reading. It was great to work with you guys today, and I'll see you on day 3.